The bus door clattered open with the tired sigh of an old accordion, and the first German prisoner down the steps squinted into a light he didn't expect. He thought factory meant dimness and grease and the kind of silence you get when everyone is straining at stubborn bolts. Instead, the air had a soft, continuous hum, the way an ocean sounds from a balcony, constant, layered, organized noise. The guard motioned them forward, and they walked under a chain-link archway where a stenciled sign listed shift times like train schedules, clean and certain. Inside, the space opened and kept opening. A cathedral made of girders and daylight, a slab floor shining with oil, stain freckles, and, slicing the length of the building, a slow river of steel. Shermans. Hulls moving nose to tail on a broad conveyor that never stopped, just inched, as if refusing to acknowledge the drama of war outside the walls. The first shock for them wasn't the machines, it was the rhythm. They expected chaos, every man a soloist, every station improvising. They didn't find drama, they found choreography. Overhead cranes drifted like giant herons, lifting turrets and setting them down with a single breath's worth of sway. A signal bell chirped and a talk team stepped forward, their wrenches calibrated and lined like surgical instruments. A paint booth at the far end exhaled, and finished tanks nosed into sunlight in olive coats that looked dry as leaves. Nothing raced, nothing paused, and everything moved with the stubborn inevitability of a clock. "Keep your hands to yourselves and your eyes where they belong," the foreman told the group in friendly English that carried authority without the need to shout. The POWs nodded. They wanted to look away, if only to preserve a little pride, but the line wouldn't let them. Your gaze latched on and travelled down it the way a finger runs a seam. At Station 3, 2 men fed plate into a flame cutter, and the burning head traced a curve that looked too graceful to be practical. A glowing orange thread drawn with a patient hand. At Station 7, a jig rose from the floor like a cradle, holding a hull at just the right angle so welders could lay beads without contortion. At Station 12, a set of bogey assemblies came out of a crate, painted with a different company's logo entirely, and no one blinked. They were bolted to the hull in minutes, the holes meeting the bolts like old friends. The men stared and did the math in their heads. A tank, to them, was a personality. It had moods. You coaxed it to life carefully, with file strokes and cleverness and time. Here, a tank was a promise. It was a drawing made three-dimensional by fixtures you couldn't argue with. The line didn't beg for genius. It required obedience to a standard. And that, more than anything, affronted and fascinated them. Their pride wanted to object. Quality can't be timed. But their eyes kept returning to the little rituals that made quality automatic. The gauge blocks laid on a bench like a priest's vestments, the coloured tags on wiring looms, the way the crane operator dipped his hook an inch, then another, until the turret ring kissed the race with a sound you felt in your molars. Outside, the war still had its roar. Inside, the plant made a different kind of answer. Not speeches, not boasts, not the beautiful singularity of a master craftsman's touch, an answer of tempo. The bell again. Hands move. The conveyor inches. A clipboard shows a tally and the numbers don't swagger, they accumulate. The visitor's surprise became a physical thing, a change in posture, shoulders that had squared to mock what they expected softening by degrees. The foreman, catching their look, smiled a little. He didn't gloat. People who live inside systems don't have to brag. The system speaks for them. When the first completed Sherman rolled under the high doors toward the proving ground, its engine note threaded through the shop's hum. A mechanic walked alongside, listening with his head tilted as if the tank were a singer and he the accompanist. The prisoners watched it go, and then, in the same breath, saw the next hull arrive at the final station, already wearing its tracks, already wired, already waiting for a turret. The gap between almost done and done wasn't days. It was minutes, and you could count them on your hands. That's the right place to start, because it explains the shock. It wasn't about the American tank being perfect. It was about the American way of making being indifferent to drama. The line would keep moving if you judged it. The line would keep moving if you admired it. It would keep moving after the bus returned these men to a camp, and it would keep moving the next morning regardless of who won arguments in canteens and offices and newspapers. That steady defiance is what they felt first, and it reoriented them. They expected improvisation, they got inevitability, and once that realization digs in, everything else the episode shows the jigs and gauges, the supply trucks that arrive before the bins run dry. The test track where faults become fixes reads differently, not as tricks, but as the grammar of a language where the sentence always ends with, "Another tank rolls out." They didn't applaud. No one would have allowed that. They simply stood longer than the guards expected, eyes tracking the line as if trying to commit the cadence to memory. Later, some of them would try to describe it in letters that censors would blacken. But before any ink or scissors, before any words, there was a look, the human face doing the quiet arithmetic of awe. The bus would fill again, the gate would clatter, the hum would continue, and the story would be ready to widen from the first glimpse to the context that made it inevitable. The surprise only makes sense if you first sit on that bus as it grinds through a Midwestern morning and listen to what these men carried in their heads. Their picture of American industry wasn't drawn from experience. It was painted by slogans, rumors, and barracks lectures that made complex places feel simple. The United States, they were told, was rich in a childlike way, everything in bulk, little in finesse. Its workers were said to be undisciplined and mercenary, only moving fast if you waved money at them. Its machines were good enough, a phrase meant as an insult, not a strategy. And the nation itself, so the talk went, had no stomach for patient engineering. If you wanted a radio that could survive mud, or an optic that kept its zero, or a drivetrain that turned under load without complaint, you were supposed to look to German hands. That worldview was tidy because it stayed distant. No one on that bus had walked a Detroit line. They had lived inside different assumptions. Their pride was not imagined. It came from real skill file work you could balance a coin on, fits you could feel with eyes closed, tolerances checked by men who treated gauges like commandments. They knew what virtue looked like in a shop where material was precious, machine time rationed, electricity sometimes erratic, and every completed assembly wore the fingerprints of ingenuity. When they spoke about their own tanks, the words came from love and frustration in equal measure. "She is powerful," one would say, and then add, "when she runs." They joked about carrying a little bench in their heads. Wherever you plant it, you are your own last machine. That faith in individual fixes hardened into an ideology. If quality can be made by a few excellent people, then any system that requires thousands of average people must be false. The bus windows framed a country that didn't care about that argument. Cornfields, smokestacks, the soft grid of small towns. At a railroad crossing, a freight rolled by with flat cars stacked with crates you could stand inside. The men pressed to glass, counting. On every crate a stencil. On every stencil a code. The abundance wasn't what bent their pride. It was the organization of the abundance, the idea that logistics themselves could be a craft as exact as anything you do at a bench. It's easier, always, to dismiss wealth than to explain coordination. Propaganda had taught them to think of America as a lucky spill of resources. But luck doesn't put a part in a bin the minute before a worker reaches for it. Luck doesn't make a crane drift like a metronome. Luck doesn't write schedules so people's lives click into place like parts. What propaganda gets wrong isn't only facts, it's pace. It loves the dramatic image, the lone genius, the miracle fix, the heroic error that becomes a breakthrough. It discards boring realities that make complex outputs possible. Standard drawings, supplier audits, a habit of changing the drawing when the field reports tell you to, not when pride says your first idea must be right. On the bus, one man described a gearbox he had coaxed to life after a night of filing and cursing. His seatmate nodded, impressed. The story's moral "skill saves the day" felt natural. Now imagine confronting a place where the moral had changed. Good standards save every day. That is a harder sentence to admire if your identity is built on rescue. We shouldn't caricature them in reverse. They weren't fools. They were professionals inside another tradition. And traditions defend themselves by telling stories that make outsiders ridiculous. In their stories, American workers were careless because Americans were comfortable. American products failed because Americans cut corners. American factories rushed because they didn't know how to do anything else. Those stories survive as long as they're untested by proximity. The bus closed distance. Propaganda evaporates faster than water when the heat source is evidence. What remains is embarrassment and curiosity, unequal measure. The foreman who met them at the gate didn't speak in abstractions. He didn't say, "tact time," or "supply chain." He pointed at the floor tape and said, "Please walk this side." He touched a bin and said, "This is empty at 2 o'clock, so the truck comes at 1:45. He lifted a wiring harness and said, "Green to green, black to black, red to red. No heroics." That last phrase startled one of the prisoners enough that he repeated it under his breath, as if trying it on for meaning. No heroics. In some shops, that would feel like an insult. Here, it sounded like confidence, like the system had planned for human limitations and removed as many traps as it could. When propaganda fails, two temptations appear. One is denial. You pretend you didn't see what you saw. The other is awe without understanding. You decide the thing you saw is magic and stop asking questions. The episode avoids both. It tells viewers, clearly and in plain language, that this plant functions because of design choices and habits, not because Americans are somehow mystically efficient. It invites the audience to look at the stuff propaganda ignores, the fixtures, the standardized parts, the willingness to simplify a design if simplification increases uptime. And it names the emotional part honestly. If you learn to love excellence expressed through virtuoso work, admiring excellence expressed through repeatable flow takes practice. That practice began the minute the bus door opened. One more expectation traveled with them. That speed equals sloppiness. That idea is like a burr. It sticks even when you shake your head. Movies and brag sheets reward drama. They do not film a man checking a hole with a go divided by no-go gauge 15 times an hour for 8 hours without a single complaint. Yet that's where reliability is born in boredom, embraced with dignity. The visitors didn't have those words yet. They had a feeling of being slightly out of breath while standing still. They stepped into a place where time behaved differently, and that disorientation is faithful to how culture shock operates. Step 1 is confusion. Step 2 is defensiveness. Step 3, if you're lucky, is curiosity. This story is about walking them to step 3 without humiliating them along the way. Because the goal isn't to score points, it's to show what a manufacturing philosophy looks like when you let it speak for itself, one measured station at a time. To understand why this factory felt inevitable, not merely impressive, you have to pull the camera back to the national frame. The United States didn't just add more shifts to existing shops. It changed how work was imagined. The key mental move is simple to say and hard to live. Treat a complex machine not as a single clever object, but as a chain of standardized promises. Each promise is small. This hole will be this size. This surface will be this flat. This harness will match these colors. This crate will arrive by this hour. None of that is a headline. All of it is a revolution when applied consistently at scale. Think of it as orchestrating a symphony instead of cheering a solo. The conductor is the schedule. The sheet music is the drawing. The musicians are stations that master one part. If a violinist improvises brilliantly, but drifts off tempo, the piece falls apart. The factory's answer is to make drifting harder than playing in time. That's what fixtures do. That's what jigs do. That's what color coding does. And when something in the score proves unplayable at tempo because a part jams or a tolerance is too fussy or a supplier keeps slipping, the composer doesn't scold. He revises the score. America learned to revise the score fast. That habit, not mere affluence, is the secret. Inside the walls, the mindset shows up as public math. A chalkboard near the entrance lists yesterday's throughput and defects. It's not art, but it is a ritual. Numbers written where everyone can see take pride out of the shadows and make it social. The foreman isn't merely barking orders. He's defending a tempo. When a problem appears, a weld pool that doesn't wet right, a bearing that runs hot, the response isn't, find a magician. It's, which promise didn't hold? Because if you find the promise that failed, you can change a fixture or a drawing or a vendor. Then tomorrow's chalk looks different. This is where the country's wider grid matters. A plant that treats its suppliers like partners, not adversaries, can ask for changes without hearings and drama. A railroad schedule tuned to the factory's taked time keeps bins from starving. A workforce trained to proficiency fast, paid predictably, and managed with the basics of respect doesn't need to be threatened into showing up. People romanticize genius because it is dramatic. Systems feel unromantic. But in a war, the unromantic wins more reliably than the dramatic. A well-run system produces boring triumphs. A part arrives when it should. A tank passes a test the first time. A problem reported on Monday is fixed in drawing form by Thursday. The POWs felt that mindset without the vocabulary. They saw the way supervisors stood. Not looming, not prowling, but scanning with a posture like a lifeguard's calm until they aren't. They heard the way workers spoke to each other. Jargon trimmed to essentials. Humor that keeps boredom from souring. A refusal to narrate heroics. When you've taught 1,000 people to do something the same way, your drama budget is best spent on edge cases. The line's serenity wasn't apathy. It was the earned quiet of constraints doing their job. Even the plant's mistakes teach the point. A crane drops a turret an inch too far. It thumps. The ring complains. A bearing scuffs. No one screams. The team chalks the incident. The turret gets lifted to the rework bay, and the operator fills out a card that will appear at a morning meeting where people talk about process, not guilt. The plant assumes humans err and builds so that error becomes signal, not catastrophe. That is the production mindset in a sentence. Make it easier to fix than to hide, easier to report than to deny, easier to adjust the system than to hope the next person will be luckier. Why does this matter for tanks specifically? Because war punishes rare beauty and rewards common reliability. A machine that is exquisite but fragile makes for wonderful stories and poor statistics. A machine that is simple enough to be built by the tens of thousands and sturdy enough to be mended by a tired crewman with a short tool roll makes for dull stories and good outcomes. The national mindset tilted toward the latter while keeping enough competence and pride alive at each station to prevent the slip into junk. Good enough? Wasn't a shrug. It was a disciplined bar set at the point where output times uptime yields the best curve. A final note on tempo. The factory's clock isn't just a bell, it's the people's lives. Shifts start when they should. Pay arrives when it should. Breaks are the same length every day. That predictability is not softness, it's the skeleton that lets the muscle work. It turns attendance from a test of fortitude into a habit. It turns learning from a private endeavor into a public resource. What one worker figures out at noon becomes a changed instruction by the next morning. None of that fits into a propaganda poster because it lacks a face. But if you want to get 1,000 tanks out the door with fewer surprises than any fairy tale deserves, you build a nation that prefers standards to poses. The POWs stood in that preference, and even if they didn't bless it with words, they recognized the stability under their boots. It felt like standing on a ship's deck in calm seas. You don't perceive the movement, but the shoreline shifts, and at the end of the day, you're somewhere else entirely. The Sherman that slid past their view wasn't an accident of abundance. It was a design chosen and refined to be built in large numbers by many hands in many places without warping into incompatibility. That sentence hides a dozen hard choices. Start with the hull. You can build a hull from plate that you weld, or you can cast it in big pieces. Each path has quirks. Welding gives you flexibility cut plates to drawing. Hold them in jigs, and join them into a geometry that matches the blueprint. Casting gives you integrated shapes, curves that would take eternity to weld appear from a mold in one pour. America said yes to both, not because indecision is wise, but because flexibility is. If a foundry could pour it accurately, pour it. If a welding shop could fit it fast and true, weld it. The design didn't punish either route. It welcomed both, and made sure the mating surfaces and hard dimensions cared only about the promise, not the method. Look under the hull, at the running gear. The bogies, the wheel, and spring assemblies that carry the track come as units. 4 bolts, a lifter, a predictable torque. You don't build them on the tank. You build them somewhere else with tools set for that exact job, where a worker can master the part intimately and repeat it. Then you carry the unit to the hull and it becomes a moment, not a saga. If a bogie from a plant in one state meets a hull from another, and the bolt holes greet each other, that's not luck. That's standards meeting self-respect. The prisoners watched one of those swaps happen as if they'd been rehearsing their own disbelief. The foreman didn't slow the show. He didn't make it a demonstration. He acted like it was Tuesday, because it was. Inside, the powertrain told the same story. You can design a tank around one engine and become hostage to that engine's maker. Or you can design a tank around an envelope, these dimensions, this power range, these mounting points, and let multiple suppliers fill it. The latter isn't as easy as announcing options. It requires drawing the interfaces so cleanly that a different engine slides in without a day of hand fitting, and it requires drawing the support system's fuel, air, cooling, exhaust, so their variations are absorbed upstream, not on the line. That's how you turn a country into a single factory, not by making everything the same, but by making every difference polite at the handshake points. The turret ring is a quiet star of this show. Cut and ground to no-nonsense dimensions, it lets a turret from another plant's sand mold sit down and spin without drama. If the ring were a bespoke miracle that depended on a single machinist's temperament, you could not ship it by the trainload and expect happiness at the other end. When the crane lowers the turret and the ring kisses the race, what you are seeing is respect paid to tolerances no one brags about at parties. The prisoners noticed. They didn't clap, but a man who has spent a day filing a stubborn misfit feels relief in his bones when something aligns because it was drawn right months ago. Wiring looms tell the same truth with color. You could wire a tank like a bespoke guitar, letting each craftsman route wires according to aesthetics and judgment. Or you can route a harness along clips placed so a tired hand can only do it one way and get a neat, serviceable result. The latter choice concedes something romantic and gains something essential. The next human who must fix this thing in rain or fear will find logic instead of personality. Green to green, black to black, red to red, is both kindergarten, simple and war-smart. None of this pretends the Sherman had no flaws. The design inherited compromises, learned under fire, and changed over time. What makes its story instructive is not perfection, but adaptability. When field reports said a hatch was too small for crews to escape quickly, the drawing changed, and the change rippled back to jigs and forward to every plant. When a certain gearbox didn't enjoy heat, venting and cooling paths were adjusted. A design welded to pride cannot move. A design welded to purpose and standards can. The plant's rhythm hardened that adaptability into habit. It isn't noble to change your mind because of reality. It's just mature. War forces maturity on metal and on men. The prisoners might not have named it this way, but they encountered a philosophy that says, build so that the average worker can do excellent work, the average shop can make consistent parts, and the average crew can keep the machine alive. That sounds like a lowering of ambition if you are in love with virtuosity. It is, in fact, the most ambitious thing you can attempt at the size a war demands. Design for manufacturability is an ugly phrase, with a beautiful consequence. More tanks that start in the morning and keep starting. In the arithmetic of campaigns, that reliability feeds a curve no single duel can bend. As Chapter 4 closes, you can feel the argument settling. We aren't squinting at a miracle. We are seeing an ecosystem. The hull is a decision. The bogey is a decision. The ring is a decision. The harness is a decision. Each decision says, privilege interchange over improvisation, privilege clarity over cleverness, privilege the fix that can be taught over the fix that must be admired. The conveyor doesn't carry steel. It carries those decisions past stations staffed by people who were hired to make promises tangible. In that sense, the factory is not a building, it is a curriculum for reality. And the POWs, who arrived with lectures in their heads about who makes well and who merely makes fast, stood in that curriculum long enough to start learning the lesson the hum was trying to teach. Excellence at scale looks quiet until you count. The tour truly begins when you stop watching the line as a whole and start following a single tank, like a traveller with a stamped passport. It enters as plate plain steel, nothing to romanticize, stacked and chalk-marked for the day's cut list. A crane's chain ticks and the plate settles on the flame table. The cutter head wakes with a contained roar and draws heat the way a fountain pen draws ink. The kerf a thin orange seam that cools into compliance. No one crowds the show because it isn't a show. The operator stands with his hand on a control the way a conductor holds. A baton relaxed, watchful, with the calm of someone who trusts math more than moods. A part falls free. Another follows. The skeleton of the plate looks like lace in iron, and then it, too, is lifted away to a bin labelled with a code that means the next room will know exactly what to expect and when. Walk 10 paces, and the smell changes less sweetness from the torch, more grounded metal, the astringent note of cutting oil and the clean sour of fresh weld. One bay over, a fixture rises from the floor. No poetry here. It's a squared, braced, unapologetic piece of tooling that refuses error. Hull sides lean into it, edges kiss edges, and clamps bite with the same force every time. Two welders approach from opposite directions, beads puddling and walking forward with a slow, hypnotic confidence. They don't find the geometry, they are confirmed by it. Your eye tracks the sequence. Tack, measure, weld, brush, gauge. A man in a cap steps in with a fillet gauge, checks a corner, initials a tag. The tag travels with the hull like a passport stamp that says this joint meets the promise, proceed. That word promise follows us into machining, where the rough shape earns the right to be called a part. Bored holes speak the only language that matters: diameter and roundness, finish and position. The operator doesn't grimace or boast. He checks, notes, resets. The work is anesthetic to ego. That's its beauty. At a bench, a go divided by no-go gauge turns a question into a light switch. Yes, no. When it's yes, the part doesn't just fit here. It will fit anywhere this drawing is understood. When it's no, the part doesn't get argued with. It gets fixed or scrapped without shame. The POWs linger because this is the moment their old stories would summon a master with special hands. Here, the master is the fixture that holds, and the tool that cuts, and the special is the discipline to stop talking and change the setup so the next 1,000 are right. We follow the tank forward to the marriage of subassemblies, where time itself looks like it's been cut into equal pieces. A clock high on a column shows the minute hand, and beneath it, stations beat like the seconds on a metronome. A bin empties, a new bin arrives. A man reaches without looking because he has reached this way for months, and the part is always where it should be. The bogey assemblies roll in their crate like obedient pets. A woman with a torque wrench leans, clicks, leans, clicks, her movement so consistent it looks like breathing. Across the aisle, a harness snakes into the hull along clips that refuse improvisation. Green to green, black to black, red to red. A young worker grins when the loom snaps home. The click is not loud, but it is decisive, and decisiveness, repeated, becomes music. Noise here isn't chaos, it's texture. The plant has layers, the bass of presses, the baritone of conveyors, the bright percussion of impact drivers reaching torque and chattering out. Over all of it, an overhead voice, not scolding but firm, announces a temporary halt at Station 14 to inspect a hydraulic fitting. The conveyor eases to a contented pause. not a stall, the way a long train seems to inhale at a station. People step where they should step. No one wanders. A supervisor crouches beside the fitting and smiles, not because there's trouble, but because trouble arrived early and politely. 10 minutes later, the voice returns, thanks the station, and tempo resumes. The prisoners exchange a look with the astonishment of men seeing a fire drilled and extinguished while the building keeps singing. Then paint. A booth that eats raw olive and exhales a colour every schoolchild can sketch from memory. The guns don't sweep with swagger. They move with the economy of someone who knows how much paint to lay down for coverage without wasting time. Overspray drifts like mist in the light but doesn't dissolve the plant's reality. It gilds it. When the tank reappears, it looks finished to a casual eye, but the plant refuses that vanity. Finished is a test, not a colour. So we go to the test. Outside, a proving track loops like a racetrack, and a dirt road had a sturdy child. The tank drops from a ramp with an authoritative clank, the track snaking and then settling into a hungry, regular bite. The driver listens for complaint heat where there should be warmth, rattle where there should be murmur. The turret turns. The gun elevates. A brake squeals slightly, then clears its throat. On the periphery, a rework bay waits openly, not hidden behind curtains. A crew there is already mid-fix on another vehicle, panels off, tools laid on a cloth like a surgeon's tray. The point isn't to banish errors to secrecy, it's to pull them out of the line, cure them, and fold the lesson back into the process where it will matter tomorrow. Back inside, the visitor sees things the first glance missed, little pockets of comfort that keep humans human in the machine's shadow. A water cooler with dented sides, the bulletin board with a photo from last Friday's softball game, a line of lunch pails that prove appetites and schedules are as real as tolerances. A worker taps a cigarette from a pack, then tucks it back because the whistle isn't for 5 minutes, and habits keep promises honest. In another corner, a supervisor quietly swaps a new hire off a task that requires forearms like cables and places him at a bench with lighter assemblies. Nobody make a speech about safety or retention. The swap is the speech. By the time the bus will load again, the POWs have walked the length of a building that has more in common with a well-run station than with any workshop they knew. The romance they brought, the belief that excellence only wears a single pair of hands, hasn't vanished. It has been broadened. The plant's secret is simple enough to miss. Every fixture is a teacher, every gauge is a referee. Every station is a promise that the next station can trust. Glory will be measured in miles travelled, not in adjectives. The tank we followed gets its final stamp and rumbles out into a light that makes the paint look almost soft. Another hull inches in to take its place, and the plant's true achievement reveals itself, not in any single moment of brilliance, but in the refusal to let a single moment matter more than the flow. The prejudice the prisoners carried that speed produces slop deserves to be confronted in daylight. The plant does not deny the charge. It reframes it. Speed here is not a daredevil sprint. It is a cadence refereed by metrics. The word you hear if you listen closely isn't faster. It's regular. Regular beats are kinder to quality than erratic dashes. That's what tarked time enforces. A shared, predictable pace that allows every upstream promise to meet every downstream need without panic. When things move at the same rate, waste has nowhere to hide, and drama has nothing to feed on. Look at one station, any station, and you see the rhythm already trained into hands and eyes. A worker lifts a part and places it into a locator that is the shape of rightness, a metal memory of where the part belongs. He doesn't eyeball. The locator refuses wrong. He runs fasteners until the wrench clicks at a preset torque, and then he stops exactly there, not because he is guessing, but because the wrench says the promise has been met. He checks a line on a template. It's green. He checks a second. It's green. The ritual would bore a poet and gladden an engineer. Boredom is quality's best friend when boredom is the product of clarity. The prisoners watch 3 cycles and could repeat them in their sleep. That's the point. The work makes sameness virtuous. Good enough, in this place, is an argument about where quality lives. It doesn't live in invisible tolerances that will never matter in a field repair. It doesn't live in ceremonial tightness that exhausts hands for the satisfaction of saying a number too small to matter out loud. It lives in the curve where production, volume, and field reliability multiply to give the best outcome for a force that needs machines to start, move, and fight every day. If a bracket can be thicker and cheaper rather than thin and precious, the choice is not ugliness. It's mercy for the operator, for the mechanic, for the mission. If a hatch can be cut larger so men can leave a burning tank faster, the drawing changes. The pride here is not in defending yesterday's idea, it's in improving tomorrow's odds. Speed without reflection causes recurrence of errors. Speed with reflection exposes errors early and starves them of oxygen. That's why defect boards and morning huddles matter, not because meetings are fashionable, but because a 5-minute stand-up in front of a chart that shows a spike forces adults to behave like adults. No one is flayed. The plant does not fetishize blame. It fetishizes fixes. We saw 3 leaks at Station 9. Heads turn. A fitter squints at the chart, then at the clamp design. This cup traps air. A quick scribble. The clamp will get a hole this afternoon. Tomorrow the leaks are gone. You can call that good enough if you want to miss the point. The point is good and enough every day. Our visitors carry their own memory of speed, officers demanding miracles, schedules that compressed until people lied to survive the week, corners cut in the point is woe, wrong places, because oversight measured the wrong thing. Of course, such speed corrupts. It doesn't feel like cadence. It feels like flight from a fire you started yourself. The factory's version is almost the opposite. It slows you down until you can be fast safely. It makes parts the same everywhere, so rework is rare and boring. It tells supervisors to remove obstacles instead of adding speeches. It stops the line when it must, and only where it must, and restarts without melodrama. The idea that this can be learned rather than inherited, that any group of reasonable adults can be taught to move together at this pace, may be the most subversive thought the prisoners take away. The critics who romanticize slowness usually confuse 2 different goods, craft and care. Craft is the joy of shaping matter by hand in ways that call attention to the maker. Care is the refusal to lie to the future. You can have both, but they are not the same. This plant lavishes care on interfaces, on fasteners, on maintainability. It leaves craft to the spaces where variety still rules: the rework bay, the tool room, the design office that maps a field report to a drawing revision. That segregation is not disrespect. It's an honest division of labor in a world where time and blood are not infinite. The tank crew will be grateful that their broken part is held by 4 bolts reachable by a cold man with cold hands. He will not write poetry about the exact finish of a hidden casting surface. He will write a letter home because he lived. When people say mass-produced, they often mean soulless. But soul shows up here where you'd least expect it, in the attention to what a future stranger needs. A worker dresses a harness just so, not because the dress pleases him, but because he knows a man he will never meet will pull that harness in the rain and be grateful it doesn't snag. A machinist reams a hole so a pin slides with a dignified snugness because he knows an apprentice somewhere else will assemble this with the same quiet satisfaction. Good enough is empathy, measured in thousandths and minutes. High-minded? Maybe. Useful? Absolutely. The plant keeps no shrine to perfection. It keeps schedules, gauges, and a culture that refuses to panic. In that refusal, speed becomes gentle, the way a river wears stone. You feel its power not in splashes, but in the smoothness it leaves behind. The POWs began the day equating haste with waste. By the afternoon, they had an alternate picture. Pace as an ally of quality, a heartbeat that makes promises achievable. If you want a battlefield filled with machines that behave like citizens, show up, do their duty, handle stress with grace, you don't build unicorns. You build Shermans by the thousands at a clip the human eye can follow and the human wrist can trust. That's what good enough means here. Not the least you can do, but the most you can keep doing. To call this a single plant is to be fooled by walls. The truth sprawls across counties and time zones, and the humble miracle is that it arrives looking like agreement. Interchangeability is an unfashionable word, but it is the superpower that makes everything the visitors have seen inevitable. It means a bogey built on a grey morning in a company with a different logo will marry a hull welded 2 states away without sulks or filing fits. It means a gearbox from one vendor and a final drive from another will share a flange like they were raised together. It means drawings aren't suggestions, they are oaths. Begin where the parts begin, with suppliers who are treated as extensions of the line, not as scapegoats to be whipped when something goes wrong. Their tooling is audited, their gauges checked against master standards that travel like binding law. If a supplier's holes drift, the drift is not a moral failure, it's a calibration problem discovered by a visit and corrected with help. In this web, the heroes are not inspectors catching villains, they are metrologists and engineers who keep the math aligned. The prisoners expecting mystery find procedure. Instead of a hush around vendors, there is traffic phone calls, train cars, foremen who know names at the foundry because they shook those hands last month. The bins tell the same story in a language of wood and stencils. Each crate is a paragraph, part number, revision letter, quantity, lot date. Peel back the lid, and the packing makes a promise about how parts will arrive. No burrs on edges where fingers live, no metal on metal where scratches become rework. A shopman pulls a bogey out and its paint is dry, its grease fittings capped, its fasteners wrapped just enough to defeat dust. He doesn't compliment the vendor. He can't. He must assume this as normal, or the rhythm breaks. The prisoners, by contrast, do compliment it, with glances and muttered words. In their memory, crates sometimes arrived like riddles. Here they arrive like statements. Interchangeability makes scenes that feel like parables. A crate from vendor A runs low mid-shift. A forklift brings a fresh one, but from vendor B, the foreman shrugs. The parts go on the hull. No hiss, no beam filed, no holes elongated with an apology. The worker fits a washer, runs a nut, listens for the wrench's click, and puts a paint mark across the fastener to prove this touch happened. The sources are plural, the result is singular. That paradox many hands, one fit sounds mystical, until you remember the meetings that produce the drawing revisions, the gauge R&R studies no viewer will ever see, the arguments settled with numbers and a small sigh rather than with ego. Replenishment in this world looks less like rescue and more like pulse. Bins aren't allowed to starve. Cards or signals paper, light, a chalk mark erased. That's the old language of Kanban, before anyone made it into a trademark. Wake a driver, summon a truck, and refill before emptiness becomes an emergency. It is an old wisdom. Make the right thing easy to do. A picker can read a card the way a mason reads, a plumb line. The prisoners notice how few people shout. Alarm is expensive. Rhythm is cheap once you've paid the upfront cost in thought and shelves. This web doesn't exist to flatter managers. It exists to honor the soldier who will meet the product far from any crate. Interchangeability is a promise to the mechanic with mud on his chest and a wrench between his knees. The part you scrounge or receive will fit. It is a promise to the quartermaster. You can stock fewer unique pieces because multiple vendors contribute to the same spec. It is a promise to the designers. You can improve the drawing and the improvement will radiate through the web, not as rumor but as paper that changes steel. In war, promises like these are food. They keep units alive between announcements. The prisoner's craft pride finds an unexpected ally in this system. Interchangeability is not contempt for skill. It is a way to spend skill where it buys the most on making gauges that never lie, on tooling that refuses mischief, on process sheets that an impatient person can still follow. The old romance of only Franz can fit that part becomes a liability when Franz is elsewhere. The new romance, any trained person can fit that part because the part respects the drawing, sounds less dramatic and saves more lives. The POWs do not surrender their love of exactness, they move it to a place that scales. There is a moral dimension here the plant never speaks out loud. Trust made visible. To trust a vendor is to sign your name to their capability and then verify without malice. To trust a drawing is to resist the vanity of tinkering when no improvement is needed. To trust a process is to endure boredom with grace, because you know boredom is the mother of stability. The bus that will take these men away later will rattle past more crates, more stencils, more small acts of trust. They will carry back an understanding that feels, at first, like a rumor. There are places where many hands make one thing honestly, and it works. If the assembly line is the plant's heartbeat, the proving ground is its conscience. Out there, paint can't persuade, and tags don't matter. The tank either behaves or reveals why it doesn't, and either outcome is a win if you treat truth as a friend. The prisoners stand behind a yellow line and watch a driver ease the Sherman onto the loop. The engine note settles into a willing growl. The suspension does what good shoes do, disappears under the wearer. Across washboard, up a short climb, brake to a stop, pivot, move. The turret rotates to a stop with dignity instead of drama. A checklist makes its quiet way down a clipboard. The inspector's pencil taps, not impatient, just in tempo with the machine. Then the test does what honesty always does. It finds a flaw. A fine sheen of fluid freckles the hull at a seam. Not a crisis, not a flood. A leak small enough to tempt denial. No one denies. The operator points. The inspector nods. The tank's driver brings it to the rework bay, a space conspicuously central, as if to make secrecy impossible. A team meets it the way a pit crew greets a car. Panels off. Rags placed. The leak traced with dye and a hand lamp. The fitting is suspect. A replacement is fitted and torqued. Another run. Dry. A mark on a board. A note on a card that will migrate upstream to the station where similar fittings will be inspected closer for a time. No shouting, no theatre, no lies about one bad apple. The loop has done its job. Convert a problem into a fact that cannot be negotiated. The prisoners can't help contrasting this with nights they've spent coaxing a sullen machine to behave before a demonstration for a superior. If performance is theatre, you hide the misses and hope the audience applauds. If performance is process, you drag the miss into the Sunday. The plant's culture prefers Sunday morning meetings huddle around a chart with lines that move and dots that shame no one. "We saw 5 leaks yesterday," someone says. Same fitting. A toolroom man lifts a clamp prototype that will hold the subassembly at a slightly different angle so the thread seats cleanly. "Try this at station 10. Heads nod. The fix travels in plain sight. Tomorrow the dot will be lower or it won't, and either way the chart will tell the truth. There's an almost theological simplicity to this. Sin confessed, penance assigned, grace received in the form of a changed drawing or jig. The prisoners, accustomed to hiding imperfection from inspectors who see their job as punishment, begin to notice the absence of fear here. Fear exhausts. Candor energizes when it is paired with agency. A line worker can flag a defect without risking exile, and that permission is worth more than slogans about quality. You get what you reward. The plant rewards saying, "This leaks early, not late." Testing isn't only about catching failures, it's also about teaching the line what the field wants. Feedback loops run forward and back. A transmission struggles with heat after a series of stops and starts, something the test loop can simulate all day. The rework bay adds a small baffle to improve airflow. An engineer updates a drawing, suppliers adjust patterns or routings, and within a week the change appears at the station where it matters. That speed is the hard thing to imitate. It requires paper that moves, managers who listen more than they declaim, and a respect for the data that keeps you from arguing your favorite idea to death. Even the end of the process is a loop, not a wall. A tank that passes its run doesn't vanish into pride. It is logged with a matter-of-factness that keeps mysticism at bay. This one is number so-and-so. These are its serial components. This is its acceptance. It leaves with a dossier, not a legend. The men in the bay wipe their hands, not because they need applause, but because the next vehicle is already nosing in, and cadence can't be flattered into waiting. If this sounds clinical, The human warmth of the place corrects you. Rework crews know each other by first names shortened by affection. Someone hums a tune. Someone else tells a joke about the crane's moods, even though everyone knows the machine has no moods, only maintenance. A new hire makes a mistake, tightens a fitting before a gasket is seated. The lead doesn't bark. He says, "Back it off. Feel this edge? That's the seat. Now go again." The kid goes again and feels the rightness as a physical click. The lesson has been transferred without poison. That's how cultures stay strong through turnover and fatigue, through gentle precision, not ritual humiliation. In the bus later, one of the prisoners will try to explain what he saw to a man who watched a different part of the plant. He'll say, "They break things on purpose," and then correct himself. No, they let things break in a place where breaking is useful. That's the key. Failure is not a trespass. It is a teacher hired to workday shift. The plant has built a classroom for it and put it next to the line, so the commute for learning is short. The last image we keep from the day isn't glamour. It's a handwriting on a board, a number lowered by 1, a defect count updated, a promise renewed. In other stories, change is a trumpet blast. Here, it's chalk. But chalk, repeated on honest boards in honest rooms, bends curves the way tanks bend campaigns, slowly, definitively, beyond any single dramatic moment. The POWs came expecting to be impressed by volume and left surprised by something humbler. A place where truth costs nothing to speak, and because it costs nothing, people spend it lavishly. If fixtures and gauges are the plant's skeleton, people systems are its joints, places where motion must be both strong and forgiving. The prisoners expected discipline to mean barked commands and punishment waiting behind every mistake. What they found instead was a kind of administrative kindness, not sentimental, just relentlessly practical, the way a good boot is kind to a foot over a long march. It begins with training that does not pretend to be grand. New hires stand at a bench with the tool they'll actually use and a part they'll actually fit, and an instructor whose whole pride is making the right move feel natural. No lectures about the soul of industry. The soul arrives later, through repetition that becomes confidence. "Feel this," the instructor says, running a finger along a chamfer. "Hear this," he adds, letting a torque wrench click once, twice, the sound small and decisive like a tuned metronome. Lessons are smuggled into muscle memory so they can't be forgotten by nerves. Safety, here, is not a shrine of posters. It's a series of tiny conveniences that remove excuses. Gloves stacked where you reach for them without thinking. A bin at shoulder height so spines don't fold. A floor kept dry enough that the only slips are of attention, and even those have guardrails. Yellow lines that arrest wandering, railings that make clumsiness survivable, lift tables that make a two-person lift unnecessary, because the table is the second person. Supervisors intervene early with a tone that sounds like a neighborly warning rather than a final verdict. Not that way, this way. The prisoners, used to equating safety with softness, notice how little it costs the line to be decent and how much speed it buys back when no one is nursing an avoidable strain. Pay is announced, the way throughput is announced, publicly and without drama. The sheet on the bulletin board spells out base rates, shift differentials, and the small bonuses that come with hitting targets. There are no lotteries masquerading as incentives. If you do your part at the station, you earn what the sheet promised. Predictability is a moral choice disguised as paperwork. It eliminates the suspicion that managers win when workers lose, which is the poison that rots cadence from the inside. Breaks arrive when the clock says they will, not when a boss remembers generosity. Schedules that honor families produce attendance that honors schedules. None of this is romantic. All of it is efficient. The cafeteria tells the story from another angle. It smells like coffee and meatloaf, not like a speech about team spirit. Workers sit by habit rather than decree. Cliques exist, of course, but their borders are porous. A welder explains to a painter why the new jig cuts his cycle by a minute. A toolmaker sketches a tweak on a napkin and hands it to a supervisor with a shrug that says, "Try this if it helps." There is ribbing that would crumble if malice touched it. It survives because pride here is collective. The plant is not a family, it is a town. Towns endure by ordinary decency and by the knowledge that today's annoyance could be tomorrow's ally. Discipline is visible, but not theatrical. Tardiness earns a conversation and then a consequence. Poor work earns retraining before it earns replacement. Chronic carelessness is shown the door without ceremony because ceremony would feed the wrong story. The point isn't to terrify, it is to remind everyone that standards protect the honest from the sloppy. That phrase, protect the honest, lands on the prisoners harder than the posted rules. In their experience, rules often protect the loud or the connected. Here, rules feel like a fence around trust. Inside the fence, people give each other the benefit of the doubt because they know the fence will hold if doubt was misplaced. Not everything works, and the plant wastes no time pretending otherwise. A veteran at Station 6 resists a new sequence. He mutters that the old way had soul. The foreman lets the complaint air out, then takes the man to the proving ground to watch the ripple of the change. How a quicker subassembly upstream means fewer contortions downstream. How the rework bay's chart drops a line 2 days after the change goes live. The veteran grumbles less because he can see the downstream face of his pride. You cannot win an argument against a chart that tells the truth and a tank that runs cooler after a climb. The plant's genius is not that it avoids bruised egos. It is that it gives them a way to heal without theatrics. Even signage is part of the people system. Verbs, not slogans. Lift with 2. Stop here for inspection. Empty bin by 1400. The passive voice is absent because the passive voice invites shirking. The prisoners notice how much of the place is legible to a newcomer. Legibility is an ethic. It assumes a human will be tired, distracted, curious, or new, and it still asks the system to function. Where the work demands judgment, the plant asks for grown-ups. Where the work can be idiot-proofed, the plant refuses to flatter idiots by making them prove it. This pragmatic charity is the rarest resource in any wartime setting, and the reason tempo survives the 1,000 daily chances to fray. At shift change, a minute before whistles, there is a peculiar stillness, tools at rest, hands ready, eyes on the clock like sprinters, eye a pistol that never misfires. The whistle comes, not as a command but as a tide change. One group steps off, another steps on. Greetings are short because the handover is already embedded in the station's design. You do not need a ceremony to pass a baton that was placed on the mark before either runner arrived. The prisoners watch the swap with the amazement of sailors seeing a well-rehearsed crew tack into wind without raised voices. People systems, they realize, are not slogans on the wall. They are the engineered kindnesses and consistent consequences that let average people do excellent work most days. That's the miracle behind the metal, and it is human enough to feel like relief. What the men witnessed didn't stay in the plant because astonishment travels even when paper is blacked with a censor's pen. In camp that night, after chow and the small rituals of captivity boots checked, blankets folded, a familiar silence negotiated around fatigue, someone started a letter. He knew the rules. Dates vague, places unnamed, numbers avoided. Yet tone is hard to muzzle. Today we saw something unusual, he wrote, then tried again. Something I had not expected. He described conveyor belts without calling them that, cranes that moved as if on strings, and a line that never seemed to stop for arguments. He did not write Sherman. He did not write tank. He wrote about the feeling of regularity, which is a safe word that smuggles awe. Censors worked with ink and a mandate. They crossed out nouns that might feed an enemy's appetite for specifics. They left adjectives when they were harmless, but adjectives properly chosen can be contraband of a different sort. Orderly, quiet, certain, a mother reading that would think her son was safe. A friend with machining experience would read a different meaning, the music of flow. Letters like that stacked in mailbags, and some arrived whole weeks later, smelling of camp and paper and the strange way hope clings to envelopes. A few never arrived because war routes are as vulnerable as any front line, but the idea travelled nonetheless. hopping from a line in a letter to a rumor in a barracks to a comment in a Red Cross report that tried to be clinical and ended up sounding impressed. The Red Cross visitors toured with guides and clipboards, their questions careful, their smiles diplomatic, their notes filled with words that evaporate under scrutiny: adequate, satisfactory, and yet here and there a sentence broke the trance. High degree of organization was observed. Multiple suppliers appear coordinated. Output seems steady regardless of small stoppages. The staff who wrote those lines were trained not to gush. They gushed anyway, and the only way they could, by sounding bored with what should have been miraculous. Bureaucratic boredom is a kind of praise. Some POWs tried to draw what they had seen. On pages torn from notebooks, they sketched a long hall with rectangles representing stations and arrows representing motion. The arrows became too many. How do you draw rhythm? They drew cranes and forgot the wires. They drew tanks and forgot the bins. They drew people and forgot the way those people fit the space like notes fit a stave. One drawing showed a test track as a loop, with ticks at intervals to represent tasks: brake, turn, climb. The man who drew it added a small note in the margin: no shouting. He meant it as a technical observation and accidentally wrote a cultural one. In the camp's mess, talk turned to comparisons. One man had worked in a small plant back home that built precision pumps. He described the exquisite tolerances and the maddening weights for stock. Another had been a mechanic in a unit that loved their machine when it ran and swore at it when it didn't. They build so many, the first observed. Yes, the second replied. But they also build so that many can be kept alive. The distinction mattered. It stopped the conversation from becoming a shrug about wealth. Plenty of nations had money. Not all could convert it into predictability. The censors read and reread, catching a reference here, a careless detail there. A few lines disappeared under the black bar, the mention of a specific paint odor, a throwaway allusion to a railway timetable, the shape of a hatch described too precisely by a man who didn't realize details are a kind of map. Still, enough slipped through that. Months later, a family friend in a bakery heard a rumor from a returned prisoner who had been in the same camp. They billed as if time itself were a machine. No one could unpack the sentence, but it clung, the way phrases cling when they carry a truth too heavy to be measured easily. The military bureaucracy, too, collected impressions without calling them that. Reports noted the temper of captives. Morale mixed, attitudes toward American industry changing. Intelligence officers conducted interviews with a light touch, more curious than coercive, and their summaries read like ethnography, men describing a choreography they had not expected a nation of supposed amateurs to master. The officers didn't need the poetry, they needed the effect. Respect in enemies is a currency. If you can earn it without cruelty, you bank interest against future horrors. A man who believes your machines are inevitable may be quicker to surrender later or slower to launch an attack he thinks will be swallowed by tempo. Back in the plant, no one cared about letters. They cared about the day's count and the week's defect rate and whether the new clamp at Station 10 had finally strangled that minor leak. That was the source of the tone that slipped past censors. A place so steady that witnesses wrote about it the way people describe weather on a day that goes well, sunny but not hot, breeze but not draft, a light that makes ordinary things beautiful. A POW cannot write, "We are losing this war of production." He can write, "They do not seem to tire." The truth arrives intact, folded in manners and understatement, carried across borders by the humblest mail service civilization has invented. Envelopes that collect more than paper. They collect the mood of the people who touched them. Any story that includes prisoners working near war industry has to face the rules that permitted it. The plant did not conscript men at gunpoint to turn wrenches on tanks. That would have broken law and sabotaged trust. The framework was the Geneva Convention, translated into practice by armies that needed labor and by a society that, at its best, preferred law to appetite. POWs could be assigned to non-combat tasks under supervision, paid modest wages credited to their accounts, housed in camps that met minimum standards, and protected from dangerous or militarily sensitive duties. The line between near and on mattered. A captive could unload lumber, or sweep floors, or tend grounds, or stack crates. He could not be placed at a station where his hands would assemble secrets, nor at a post where sabotage would be both tempting and catastrophic. Reality is bumpier than rules, and the episode owes you the bumps without melodrama. Guards had to decide daily what proximity meant. A broom can touch a fixture. A hand can steady a crate. A curious eye can gather more than a pen can write. The solution was not paranoia, it was zoning. Work details stopped at thresholds. No one made a game of testing. Supervisors who trained Americans to fit parts did not train prisoners to do the same. The foreman's friendliness had borders. You can watch, he told them. You can move this, not that. You can ask, and I'll decide if the answer is about steel or about war. His tone never turned cruel because cruelty is lazy and undermines discipline. He was not kind for their sake. He was consistent for the line's sake. Payment was symbolic but real. A man earned credit he could spend at camp on small comforts, tobacco, writing paper, a little better soap. The pay stub, if you could call it that, recorded hours with an accountant's neatness. It wasn't generous, and it wasn't a sham. It acknowledged the dignity of time traded, even in captivity. The prisoners joked darkly that as long as the numbers added, the system would forgive any other defect. They were not entirely wrong. Systems survive on the perception that they are fair enough, and fairness here wore the face of arithmetic. Religious services were permitted and sometimes attended by men who had never bothered with church when free. Captivity distorts habits. It also reveals what anchors hold. A chaplain visited and spoke of patience without leaning on piety as a crutch. He mentioned justice as a practice rather than a verdict. The line outside the plant practiced justice the way factories practice anything through procedures, times, and places. A guard who cursed a man for being slow was corrected by another guard because slow isn't disobedient. That sentence matters. It separates annoyance from offense. It prevents a small humiliation from fracturing the fragile compact that lets order look like consent rather than compulsion. Were there abuses? Of course. Humans fill every role. A guard with too much swagger, a supervisor with an old grievance, a prisoner with a flair for tempting luck. Incidents happened. They were recorded, scolded, occasionally punished. What did not happen, in the plant that day, was systemic betrayal of the law. To pretend otherwise would be to flatter cynicism, which is as distorting as propaganda. The point isn't that America always chose the nobler path. The point is that a structure existed strong enough that many average people could behave decently most of the time without asking what decency was every morning. Structures like that are the only kind that survive seasons instead of moments. Ethics were also baked into the design decisions the prisoners witnessed. A hatch widened is not a sermon, it is a mercy. A part made interchangeable is not a slogan. It is a pledge to a future mechanic who will be cold and afraid. A rework bay in the open is not an art installation. It is a confession booth placed where anyone can use it without fear. The plant's culture didn't argue abstractly about good and evil. It made choices upstream that reduced the number of moral crises downstream. That is virtue translated into fixtures and schedules. The prisoners returned to camp with a new respect for that banalized ethics. They would not have used the phrase. They might have said, "They keep rules even when no one is watching," which is the plainest definition of integrity any shop can aspire to. The guards who marched them back did so with the same weary courtesy they had used in the morning. Courtesy is not goodness, but it is a condition in which goodness can breathe. By nightfall, everyone involved had made 100 small decisions that could have been uglier. The cumulative effect of those decisions is what you felt in the plant without having to name it. A place that works because people agree on most days to be fair. Dusk made the plant look like a lantern light pooled under high windows, the conveyor's line glowing faintly as if heat itself had color. The bus idled, a patient beast. The prisoners climbed aboard with the slow steps of men who have seen something they will be arguing with in their heads for months. The day's images arranged themselves without being asked. A jig rising from a floor like a skeleton's hand that knew exactly how to hold. A gauge turning questions into yes divided by no answers. A forklift arriving before the bin was empty. A tank shouldering into daylight with the indifference of a tide. Surprise had given way to a quieter emotion recognition. They knew competence when they saw it. They had simply believed it came in a different costume. On the ride back, fields slid past in that hypnotic way landscapes do when your mind is elsewhere. The men spoke in short bursts, the way craftsmen talk when pride won't let them praise too lavishly and honesty won't let them lie. "It moves," one said, meaning the line, and then corrected himself. "It keeps moving." Another asked a question he hadn't allowed in the morning. "Could we do this if we had to?" A third, older, shook his head slowly. "We would try to make each station elegant," he said. They tried to make each station inevitable. There was no disgrace in the observation. There was a doorway. Elegance can be taught to a few. Inevitability can be taught to many. War rewards the latter. In the weeks that followed, the plant receded for them into the blur of captivity. Memory is a poor archivist. It keeps the wrong things and misfiles the right ones. Yet certain frames refused to fade. The green of fresh paint, the way a torque wrench's click felt like permission rather than restraint. The sight of a problem being pulled from the line and corrected where everyone could see it, as if shame were a wasteful solvent you saved for actual sins. And a single sentence spoken by the foreman that lodged like a sliver. "No heroics." He had said it with a smile, not as an affront but as an invitation. Do it right so no one has to be brave later. The older a soldier gets, the more he appreciates the kind of courage that never needs to be displayed. For viewers now, far from that era but close to its consequences, the lesson lands without the dust. The Sherman story has been told through duels and doctrines, praises and condemnations, and all of those lenses have their uses. This episode, like the day our visitors lived, chooses a different focus. Not the machine as medal wearer, but the machine as proof that a society can teach itself to be predictable under strain. What stunned the prisoners is what should sober and hearten us. The most American thing about that plant was not size, it was humility turned into habit. Drawings that change when reality speaks. Fixtures that save wrists and egos. Schedules that respect bodies. Pay that respects hours. Tests that respect truth. None of those will make a poster. All of them win wars. When the bus braked at the camp gate, the guards didn't have to shout. A system that works spares voices. The men filed out, shoes on gravel, fences asserting their geometry against the evening. Behind them, the plant kept doing what it had done all day and would do again at dawn. Take promises written in graphite and turn them into promises written in steel. Somewhere inside, a rework crew glanced at a board and smiled at a smaller number. Somewhere outside, a finished tank was already halfway through its first mile on a flat car headed toward a harbour. The line neither knew nor cared who believed in it. Faith is optional. Throughput is not. Years later, some of those prisoners would explain haltingly, with the caveats experience grafts onto any memory that the visit had felt like standing on a bridge and seeing the river below as a pattern for the first time. Water does not argue. It wears stone by insisting in small acts forever. The assembly line was not an insult to craft. It was a craft so large that only many hands could hold it. If anything endures from that day, let it be this. Excellence at scale does not look like fireworks. It looks like a click you trust, a bin that's never empty, a hatch that opens when it must, and a people who choose, and choose again, to be boring where boredom saves lives. The camera pulls back in the mind's eye, the lantern fade of the plant, the bus shrinking into the grid of roads, the sky taking on that wartime dusk colour that makes smoke and cloud hard to read apart. A last thought. Not a moral, but a measure. The visitors arrived prepared to grade an enemy's vanity. They left having witnessed a philosophy. Not a secret, not a trick, not a boast. A philosophy that says the future belongs to those who can turn truth into routine without breaking the humans who must carry it out. The Sherman that rolled past them was metal. The astonishment it produced was human. And the line that made both possible, steady as a clock and gentle as a habit, is the line this story has traced so you can see what they saw, not a miracle, but a discipline moving,